By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was bleeding to death. The mighty Army of Northern Virginia, once 60,000 strong, was now a shadow of itself. Hungry, exhausted, and surrounded, it staggered west through the broken countryside of Virginia. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. General Robert E. Lee, the man who had fought the Union to a standstill for nearly 4 years, now commanded barely 25,000 men. Many of them had no shoes. Many hadn't eaten in days. Yet still, they followed him. Lee's aide, Colonel Charles Marshall, later recalled, "Men were dropping from the ranks from sheer exhaustion. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow. But they marched still because General Lee rode before them." On April 2, 1865, the lines at Petersburg finally broke. Grant's forces, after a 9-month siege, overwhelmed the Confederate defenses. Richmond, the heart of the Confederacy, fell the next day. Lee telegraphed President Jefferson Davis with grim finality, "I see no prospect of doing more than holding our position here till night. I advise that all preparations be made for leaving Richmond tonight." By April 3rd, the Confederate capital was in Union hands. Davis fled south. The dream of the Confederacy was burning itself to ash. Lee's army pushed west toward the rolling hills of Appomattox. He hoped to join forces with General Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina, but the Union cavalry, in under Philip Sheridan, had other plans. They moved fast, cutting off rail lines and supply routes. The road to salvation narrowed to a single dusty track. By April 6th, at a place called Sailor's Creek, disaster struck. More than 7,700 Confederate soldiers were surrounded and captured. Witnesses recalled Lee watching from a ridge, his face pale and grim. One officer heard him mutter, "My God, has the army dissolved?" It hadn't, but it was dying. Private John Dooley of the 1st Virginia later wrote in his diary, "We are literally starving. A few grains of corn, a bit of bacon rind." I saw men gnawing bark from the trees. Even so, Lee refused to surrender. He rode beside his men in the rain, wrapped in his old gray cloak, his once proud uniform threadbare. A Union soldier who saw him from a distance later said, "He looked like a monument, alone in the storm, bearing the weight of the South upon his shoulders." At one point, Lee's men captured a few Union supply wagons near Appomattox Station. A flicker of hope. But that same evening, Sheridan's cavalry and 2 corps of Grant's infantry closed in. By nightfall on April 8th, the Union forces had surrounded Lee's army on 3 sides. The road ahead was blocked. The road back was gone. That night, Lee sat by a small campfire, wrapped in his cape. His chief of artillery, Edward Porter Alexander, urged him to break through one last time, or scatter the army into the hills to fight a guerrilla war. Lee shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "We must consider the effect of such action on the country as a whole. It is our duty to prevent further loss of life." Those words, simple, weary, and humane, marked the end of the Confederacy more than any battle ever could. Lee turned to his adjutant, Charles Marshall. "Then I must go and see General Grant," he said. The words hung in the cold night air. For a moment, no one spoke. Marshall later remembered, "I felt my heart sink. It was as though the world itself were ending." At 5 a.m. on April 9, 1865, the remnants of Lee's army made one last attempt to break through. They advanced under General John B. Gordon, one of Lee's most trusted commanders, toward Appomattox Court House. At first, they pushed back Union cavalry. For a fleeting hour, it seemed the old spirit of the Army of Northern Virginia had returned. Then, through the mist, they saw the blue lines of Union infantry, 2 full corps, moving into position, tens of thousands of them. A Confederate officer later said, "The very earth seemed blue. The horizon was filled with them." When word reached Lee, he closed his eyes. "Then," he said, "there is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant." And with that, the man who had carried the hopes of the South for 4 bloody years spurred his horse, Traveler, toward the little village of Appomattox Court House. As the sun rose over Virginia's red clay roads, Lee was not riding to fight. He was riding to end the war. In his memoirs, Ulysses S. Grant would later write, I felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much. Two men, once brothers in the same army, now enemies, were about to meet again for the first time in nearly 20 years. And in that meeting, the fate of a nation would turn from war to peace. Before they met in that quiet Virginia parlor, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant had lived lives that could not have been more different. One born into privilege, the other into hard labor. One taught to command, the other taught to endure. Yet both, in their own way, were shaped by war and by a country that seemed destined to tear itself apart. Robert Edward Lee was born in 1807 at Stratford Hall, a grand Virginia plantation on the banks of the Potomac River. His father, Light Horse Harry Lee, was a Revolutionary War hero, a cavalryman so daring that even George Washington admired him. But fame is a fleeting gift. Harry Lee fell into debt, scandal, and prison. He died when Robert was only 11. The boy who would one day lead the South into its greatest war grew up knowing how easily honor could fall. Lee's mother, Ann Hill Carter, raised him with a quiet sense of duty, a belief that personal virtue was the foundation of civilization itself. As a young man, he entered West Point in 1825, determined to redeem his family's name. He graduated second in his class without a single demerit. In a letter home, one instructor wrote, "Young Lee is of noble bearing, exact in habit, and singularly disciplined. He will go far." In contrast, Ulysses Simpson Grant was born 15 years later, in 1822, in a small cabin in Point Pleasant, Ohio. His father, Jesse Grant, was a tanner, a man who scraped hides and sold leather. It was hard, smelly work, and young Ulysses hated every minute of it. He once said, "I never succeeded at tanning hides. I could never bear the sight of blood. I hated the work and the smell." But there was one thing he loved: horses. From the time he could walk, he could ride. By the age of 9, locals said there was no horse in Claremont County he couldn't handle. Grant wasn't born to prestige or wealth. His education was modest, his prospects limited. When his father secured him an appointment to West Point in 1839, Ulysses didn't even want to go. He thought it was a trade school where he could learn engineering. At West Point, he was quiet, unassuming, often homesick. He ranked 21st in a class of 39, but in horsemanship, he was unmatched. A classmate later recalled, "No man ever sat a horse more gracefully." Lee graduated in 1829, Grant in 1843. Both entered an army that was small, disciplined, and uncertain of its purpose in a growing republic. Then came the war with Mexico, 1846, a proving ground that would shape the next generation of American generals. Lee served as an engineer on the staff of General Winfield Scott, mapping terrain, building roads under fire, carrying orders through enemy lines. Scott called him the very best soldier I ever saw in the field. Grant, meanwhile, served under Scott and Zachary Taylor. At Monterrey, Veracruz, and Chapultepec, he showed courage and initiative. He once dragged a howitzer up a bell tower to fire down on Mexican troops, a reckless act that won him notice. Two men, while both patriots of the same flag, who never imagined they would one day face each other as enemies. After Mexico, their paths divided. Lee rose swiftly through the ranks, teaching at West Point, commanding cavalry regiments, serving as superintendent of the academy itself. Grant's story was rougher. He married Julia Dent, the daughter of a Missouri slaveholder, and struggled to provide for his growing family. He was posted to faraway garrisons, St. Louis, Detroit, then remote Fort Humboldt on the Pacific coast. There, lonely and isolated, he turned to drink. He resigned his commission in 1854 with no prospects and no money. For years, he failed at almost everything he tried: farming, real estate, business. He sold firewood on the streets of St. Louis just to buy food for his children. One acquaintance remembered him simply, "A man too honest for this world, too poor to live in it." When the Civil War began in 1861, Robert E. Lee was already famous. He was offered command of the entire Union Army by none other than Winfield Scott, his old mentor from Mexico. Lee declined. He wrote, "Though opposed to secession and deeply distressed by it, I cannot raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. He would fight, he said, not for slavery, but for Virginia. In that moment, he chose duty over politics, and in doing so, sealed his fate. Grant, on the other hand, was almost forgotten when the war broke out. He was selling leather goods in his father's store in Galena, Illinois. When the call for volunteers came, he put on his old blue uniform, threadbare, faded, and offered his services. By 1862, his victories at Fort Donelson and Shiloh had made him a national hero. He signed his letters simply, U.S. Grant. Reporters joked the initials stood for unconditional surrender. Lee commanded armies of elegance and tradition, his officers sons of old Virginia. Grant led armies of clerks, farmers, and factory hands, men hardened by work, not breeding. And yet, in the crucible of war, these two men discovered their true selves. Grant, calm, relentless, unshakable under fire. Lee, proud, principled, inspiring loyalty through quiet strength. By 1864, their paths converged. Grant, now General-in-Chief of all Union forces. Lee, the last great hope of the Confederacy. When they first faced each other in the brutal overland campaign, from the wilderness to Cold Harbor, Grant refused to retreat. Lee refused to yield. Each man came to respect the other, not in friendship but in shared suffering. As Grant later wrote, Lee was a man of much dignity, with a soldierly bearing that would inspire respect anywhere. I felt nothing but sadness that duty required me to oppose him. And now, in April 1865, as the rain soaked Virginia's red earth, destiny brought them face to face once more. Two men who had once worn the same uniform, now standing on opposite sides of a broken nation. That morning, Grant's army waited in silence. Lee, immaculate in gray and gold, rode into Appomattox Court House. Grant, mud-stained and weary, arrived soon after. One born to command, the other born to endure, and both, finally, born to end the killing. April 9th, 1865. The morning sun rises over Appomattox Court House, Virginia, a small village surrounded by rolling fields and red clay roads. The air is thick with mist and gun smoke. A few miles to the west, Lee's men are trapped. Cavalry under Philip Sheridan blocks their path, while Grant's infantry closes in from behind. The Confederate army, more on what's left of it, is encircled. At dawn, General John B. Gordon leads one last desperate attack to break through. For a brief moment, his men succeed, driving back Union cavalry with bayonets and cheers. But soon, blue-coated infantry arrive in force. The gray line collapses. Lee rides forward, calm but pale. He looks through his field glass and sees the blue lines stretching endlessly across the horizon. Then he lowers the glass and says quietly, "There is nothing left me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Those words were heard by General William Pendleton and later confirmed by Lee's aide, Charles Marshall, who would accompany him to the meeting. At 8:30 a.m., a white flag is raised. The fighting ceases. Men on both sides stand frozen, exhausted, starved, stunned. Even those who had lost brothers and friends to Lee's army felt no joy. A Union colonel later wrote, "It was not a triumph. It was too solemn for that. The man before us had fought bravely, and we pitied him." Lee mounted Traveler, adjusting the reins with steady hands. His eyes, though tired and bloodshot, betrayed no weakness. He rode back to his army, to face the men who had followed him through 4 years of unimaginable suffering. As Lee approached, his soldiers crowded around him. Many fell to their knees. Others wept openly. General John Gordon described the scene. As our beloved chief rode slowly along the lines, men pressed around him, bareheaded, tears streaming down their faces. It was no hour for cheers, only broken words of farewell and blessing. Lee removed his hat and said softly, "Men, we have fought through the war together. I have done the best I could for you. That was all. No speech of defiance, no bitterness, only grief and dignity." He then returned to his tent, sat down, and wept in silence. His aide, Colonel Charles Marshall, said he had never seen the general cry before that day. Back in the village, Grant watched the Confederate armies collapse with a sense of heavy relief, not triumph. He refused to allow any celebration. He wrote later, "The Confederates were now our countrymen, and we did not want to exult over their downfall. Grant ordered that no salutes be fired, no cheering permitted. The surrender was to be honored in silence. 2 days later, on April 12th, the Confederate infantry marched in to lay down their arms. Union troops lined the road as the gray columns approached. Their flags were tattered, their faces thin and hollow. Brigadier General Joshua L. Chamberlain, who oversaw the ceremony, later recalled, "We stood at attention, not as victors, but as men meeting men. Then by instinct I ordered the salute, the carrying of arms in honor due to brave foes. And as that gray line passed, each Confederate did the same. Honor answered honor. It was the first gesture of reconciliation, born not of politics, but of respect. In the days that followed, word spread quickly through the South. The Army of Northern Virginia, the heart of the Confederacy, was gone. President Jefferson Davis, still fleeing south, refused to believe it at first. But by the end of April, even Joseph E. Johnston would surrender his army to William Tecumseh Sherman in North Carolina. The Confederate dream, built on a secession and slavery, had finally collapsed. After the surrender, Lee returned home to Virginia. He refused all offers of political involvement and instead accepted the presidency of Washington College, now Washington and Lee University. He told his students, "Abandon all animosity and unite in rebuilding the country." In a letter written soon after Appomattox, Lee said, "I cannot trust myself to speak of the cause so dear to our hearts. My heart is too full, but we must accept the situation and make the best of it." He never sought to justify the war again. Instead, he chose silence, a silence that would define him until his death in 1870. For Grant, the surrender was not a personal victory. He wrote years later in his memoirs, penned as he was dying of cancer, "I felt no exultation, no joy. I felt sad and depressed at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause. Though that cause was one of the worst for which a people ever fought." He would go on to become President of the United States, championing civil rights and Reconstruction. Though even he admitted that the peace born at Appomattox was fragile. Appomattox was not merely the end of a war. It was the beginning of a reckoning, one that America still carries. More than 620,000 men had died. Farms were burned, cities ruined, families torn apart. But in that small parlor, when Grant and Lee shook hands, something larger survived, the possibility of forgiveness. Ely Parker, the Seneca officer who had drafted the surrender document, later said, "It was not a white man's peace, nor a black man's peace, nor a red man's peace. It was God's peace." And so the guns fell silent, not with cheers, not with vengeance, but with reverence. The Civil War, that long agony of a nation, ended not with the roar of cannons, but with a handshake. In that quiet Virginia town, two men ended a war that tore a nation apart, not with hatred, but with honor. History remembers Appomattox as a surrender, but maybe it was also a beginning. If this story moved you, honor it by sharing it. Leave a comment below on what you think Appomattox means for America today. Like and subscribe for more untold stories from the past.